Well, thanks again for joining us on our podcast. And a very special treat for us today. We have Dr. Daniel Koehn, who is with us. And I met Daniel while we were in seminary. And Daniel has gone on to go for his doctor in vocal performance from the University of Kentucky and teaches at Asbury University, Transylvania University, does some voice lessons and students and all sorts of things like that. So, Dr. Daniel Koehn, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, um, hmm. I went to Asbury University, as you did, and when I went there first, I thought that I would go into religion philosophy or into English. But I showed up for a testing weekend, and I met a young lady who was going to audition for the music department, and she said, "Oh, well, you ought to audition." I didn't bring any music. Oh, they'll have music. So I went and auditioned, and they said, "Sorry, we don't have any more scholarship money. We've already given it all out, but you should go into music." And so I did, and I got my degree at Asbury in music. I stayed an extra year to take some Bible classes because I was interested in that, and went on to the University of Kentucky and got a master's in vocal performance. And after that, I sang opera for a little while. I met my wife at the University of Kentucky, and she was on a leave of absence from Point Loma Nazarene University, so we went back out there. I sang with the San Diego Opera, and from there came to Wesley Biblical Seminary, where we met. After that, we moved to Nashville, and we're at Tribeca Nazarene University, and I taught voice there as well, and then went for my doctorate at the University of Kentucky. And while at the University of Kentucky, began teaching at Asbury, and then I've been teaching at Transy just for about a year, but really enjoying the voice teaching. And while we were in seminary is when the Lord opened up the opportunity to present John's Gospel. Unexpectedly, I found myself filling a pulpit. My wife and I were helping out at a little Methodist church in Pickens, Mississippi. And we got back after my first semester and found out that the pastor was in the hospital, and I was it until they got a new pastor. So the thought of preparing to preach every Sunday was daunting to me. I had preached probably as many times as I could count on my hand or less. And so I had memorized the Gospel of John in 8th grade in Bible quizzing. And the thought came, what if I reviewed a chapter every week and blocked it out dramatically and presented it at church every week? And so I did that. I reviewed, I got some actions and gestures and inflections together, and my wife and I would get together on a Saturday night, and she would tell me what worked and what didn't work. And actually, the Lord has really made it into a great team effort. She's the director of the show, and she's directed a lot of shows in her musical career with students in colleges, musical theater and opera and such. So she really has done a wonderful job in helping me with that. So, but as we would get together, there was a congregation, a small congregation, maybe 20 people, who would come together every week to see the next installment, and then we'd talk a little bit about it, and we went through the entire gospel that spring, and I think we finished the week before the new pastor came. So it was just, my wife and I were already doing musical concerts, and we started embedding portions of John's Gospel into the musical concerts and selecting music that was kind of thematically related with the portion we would do. So, so we have enjoyed both teaching, she's also a voice teacher, and doing this ministry as well, which has just been a great blessing for us. And I think for many people, because we get feedback that the Lord really uses it to bless people.
So there's a passage in John, and I find it almost, tongue-in-cheek, or I find it humorous to where, as you mentioned, Jesus's, language and his communication around him and his Father.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a passage when he mentions, the Father, and the teachers of the law say, no, you can't say that because you're making yourself equal with God. No,
Mm-hmm.
you're not allowed to say that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he just goes on for the next chapter to say, me and my Father and me. And,
Right.
so there, and that's the funny thing about John, when you when you read it, and that's why I'm so fascinated in how you present it, because we read it, and when we read it, it's so like back and forth, and what you see me, you see the Father, and but not just me, the one who sent me. Like it's not just clear. There's a lot of different phrases that have got to be challenging to be able to articulate. But have you found, in sharing it, how have people responded when they hear it, or see it presented in the way that you present it, versus if I just sit there and read it to myself?
Well, some people actually do follow along as they listen. It's interesting because people have different ways that some people close their eyes and just listen, but the majority will watch and listen. And I'm of that group when in a setting like this. But people respond actually very positively. They'll say that they saw things that they had never seen before, that they heard things that they have never heard before, that it came to life. Like I felt like I was right there hearing these people. And I think that that's one of the things that this kind of presentation does particularly, in that without saying it explicitly, it kind of indicates these things happened. These words were spoken. This man, this Son of Man, Son of God, came and spoke these words to these people. And you sit there and you think, wow, they were in this conversation with Jesus. I think some of it is just, this really happened. And it works on us kind of subconsciously, and we find ourselves thinking about it in a new way, because sometimes when we read it from the page, we may not think about that as much as when we see it enacted and hear inflection in the voices, and we can imagine, I can really imagine that happening in a way, so the art form helps people in that way. I want to say something about what you said earlier. Jesus, them saying, you can't talk that way. And him saying, my Father and me, my Father and me. But it's interesting that John uses I am.
Yes.
There are several times where Jesus says, I am. And I don't actually generally use those as they are written in the original Greek, because the NIV is translated it a little differently. There's only one that comes out that way, and that's chapter 8. Where Jesus says, before Abraham was born, I am, and they knew exactly what he was saying, and that's why they picked up stones to stone him. But there are other times where he uses the I am, and one of the interesting times is in the garden when they arrest him. It says, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, came out and asked them, who is it you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am, Jesus said. And when he said, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. So that's a very interesting one. When he's in the Last Supper, he's talking to his disciples, and he says, I'm telling you this. When he tells them that one of them is going to betray him, he says, I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am. So there are other times where Jesus uses that too, and I think that any Jew would know what he was saying.
He walks on water, and when they see him, he responds, by saying, "I am."
I am.
Like, what kind of response is that? But it makes sense if you know what that really means. How do you handle what we would call hard teachings of Jesus? Jesus says some pretty strong things to folks, and I think F.F. Bruce wrote a book called The Hard Teachings of Jesus, and he had 72 chapters. So, you now have to stand up, and if you are presenting straight scripture, Jesus would say some things that might be difficult to hear, but also probably difficult to say if you have to say it. Have you wrestled with, how do I communicate what would be a hard teaching of Jesus?
Yes. In fact, that's one of the things, the privilege that my wife and I have had to study this. We've been doing this sort of thing for about 15 years now, and it's really an extended Bible study, because we have to ask questions like, what's my motivation? What are these people feeling? What are they thinking? How would they say this? What is the level of what's the level of energy or anger in many things. In fact, I didn't realize until we started working on it dramatically. It never really impacted me how much danger Jesus was in almost through his entire ministry. Getting into chapter 5 and then 7 and 8, where the religious leaders are maneuvering and trying to kill him, and where he's answering them and speaking to them, and you can just, oh my goodness, Jesus, you said that? That's gonna escalate. My Father is always at his work, and I too am working. For this reason, they tried all the harder to kill him, because but what we found in those questions was, how do you portray Jesus in a way, which I believe, in the way that he was, which was, the anger of a righteous man is different than the anger of a wicked man. There are different motivations. There were times where Jesus was indignant, and yet he did not lose self-control. He did not lose himself in his anger. And I think that there were probably times with the religious leaders where it was so infuriating to them what he was saying, what he was implying, and they didn't believe it, and it reflected poorly on them. That it's interesting in this kind of a narrative to go back and forth between what they say and what he says, and show frustration on both parts, but one of them that's very fleshly and one of them that's very godly. And so we've had to ask questions like that and work through it, and had so far 15 years now to kind of work on that balance. But for instance, difficult sayings, I would think of I would think of chapter 6, where he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you, to where many of his followers were getting ready to leave, to the point where he said to the 12, that's right, do you want to leave too? But at the end of chapter 8, where he's speaking to the Jews, it says, to the Jews who had believed him, and he says, if you hold to my teaching, you're really my disciples, and then you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. They said, well, we're Abraham's descendants, never been slaves of anyone. How can you say that we'll be set free? And the whole thing escalates to the point where he says, yeah, but you want to kill me, and so you're sons of your father the devil, because you do what your father wants to do, and he was a murderer. He's a murderer, you are murderers. And he's saying these things to him, and then they respond by saying, aren't we right in saying that you're a Samaritan and demon-possessed? Which again is a dig, that your mother got pregnant out of wedlock. It was not Joseph. It was probably a Samaritan. You are an inbreed. That was a real dig. And so when he says, they say, aren't we right in saying you're a Samaritan and demon-possessed? And he has to respond and say, I'm not possessed by a demon, but I honor my Father. I am in right relationship to the one above me. But you dishonor me. You are in wrong relationship to the one above you. And they get so angry because he claims that he has seen Abraham, or that Abraham has seen him. You're only 50 years old, and then he makes that statement. But the interchange of that it's very interesting. And sometimes in rehearsal, we'll just have moments at different points where it's just like, oh my. We'll have to stop and take a moment and let things sink in. So, yeah.
So hearing it too, when I read it, it's almost like, as we've been going through Bible study in Lent in the Gospel of John, I kind of use the phrase, he's poking the bear. Stop poking the bear. Like, you can't say to the religious elite of the day those things and expect to win friends and influence people. God's word does not dwell in you. You don't hear his voice. You don't, you're not accusing me, or I will not be your accuser. Moses will be your accuser. I'm like, you can't say that stuff to these guys.
Right.
And
yet it's the truth.
Right.
It's the truth. And what hope do they have except that somebody who loves them, that there's someone who loves them enough to tell them the truth. That's it. And that's sometimes the thing God calls us to do fits well with how we feel and how we want to relate to people. But sometimes he calls us to say hard things to people, not to destroy them, not simply to poke the bear, uh, but for their hope. Um, because there's a time, I can't remember where is it, where he says, "I mention this that you may be saved." And I think it might even be chapter 5 where he's speaking to the religious leaders. "I mention this that you may." Oh, John was a lamp that burned and gave light,
That's right.
and you chose for a time to enjoy his light. But so yeah, he said some hard things.
So you're commissioned through the Francis Asbury Society,
Yes.
and I guess one of the things that you would probably describe yourself or have described yourself in the past is like an evangelist in the arts.
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
safe to say?
Mm-hmm.
So when you hear the phrase evangelist in the arts, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it means the evangelist part means that we are commissioned to take the gospel and communicate the gospel to people. In the arts, to me, indicates that the way we're doing it is not generally in a traditional way of preaching or teaching, although we do offer that, we do that as well, but doing it in an artistic, creative way through music and through drama. And the dramatic portion is what I do with John's Gospel, verbatim scripture, telling it as a story. But there are things that can go in when you see something and hear something dramatically presented that is a creative way that you don't generally hear in a sermon on Sunday morning. And when you combine music with that, these forces kind of stand up together as witnesses, as further witnesses to say, yes, this message is true. And so I find the arts to be really another witness to the truth of the message, a witness that comes alongside and says, through a dramatic or musical art form, we also concur with this. So, and I find that creative, artistic ways of presenting the gospel people are very open to that today, and it goes in a little bit different way, and it kind of comes in through the back door and helps people to see the truth and to regard it and consider it in a way a little bit different than hearing a preached message.
So talk a little bit more around the creative element of the presentation of the gospel. Where in some ways do people lack in creativity, or where have you seen excellence in a presentation, whether it be sermon or other forms of art,
Mm-hmm.
that would help bring the gospel to life?
Mm-hmm. Well, some things where I've really seen excellence, examples of that. I remember a ballet group called Ballet Magnificat. They were out of Jackson, Mississippi.
Sure.
And I first saw them. I never got a chance to see them in Jackson, but I saw them in Nashville. They came to a large Baptist church there in Nashville, and I remember seeing what they did. There were some elements of music and spoken word, but the primary thing was the dancing. And I remember thinking as I watched a presentation of the gospel with dance and with red ribbons and sheets indicating the blood and the baptism in creative ways that go deeper than I could articulate. I remember thinking, this, I think, is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Because it resonated deeply with the truth of the gospel, and yet the beauty of the presentation was, to me, very moving. And so I remember that. Another thing I would mention is Max McLean, who is kind of the inspiration for what I do with John's Gospel. I was singing a role with the outreach ensemble of the Chicago Lyric, and they had put me up in a hotel that was walking distance to Moody Bible Church while I was there in Chicago. And I went and saw Max McLean for the first time. I had never heard of him before, but he presented the first half of the book of Genesis up through the offering of Isaac on the altar. And I had never seen anything like that. And as I sat and listened, I remember just the themes of the book coming together, kind of arising out of the story in a way that I had never experienced before. There was something very beautiful about it, and something very engaging about it, just listening to the scripture. Musically, one of the musicians that is just one of my favorite musicians is Ken Miedema. He's had a long career in as a singer and songwriter. He's blind, and but is fabulous on the keyboard, and he's very good, very creative, and a very quick thinker. And I remember he came. I've seen him 3 or 4 times, but oftentimes in his concerts, he got his education actually in music therapy, and so he started out helping people, using music to help people who were in need of particular healing. And then he took that over into the church and said, well, the church is in need of healing too. Let's do this the same way. And one element that I really like that's very creative about his presentation of the gospel is that he will have times where he opens the mic and says, would somebody, I'd like 2 or 3 people from the congregation to come and tell a story. I remember one time he said, would you tell a story of a time when someone else was Christ to you? A time when you were in need and you didn't know where help was coming from, and somebody ministered to you. Would you just get up and tell a story? And so people came up and they would tell a story, and at their last breath, the music would start, and he would distill what they had said and put it into a song that seemed like a finished work of art, rhymed, structured, with a bridge, and it was the very same thing that we had just heard. And so I really appreciate that creative approach. Things that just take the gospel and help you see that in every part of life, that the Lord is the Lord of art, that he created it, and that in the field of creative expression, we live and move in him, and we live and move in his world. And so every element of his world and everything that we experience and are grateful for in our life comes from him. And so he should rule in all of that. And when a person is in the world of the arts, which so deeply has the potential to so deeply affect us, and does what they do with excellence, it's just another witness that the Lord also is Lord of the arts, and that he is the Lord of all.
We wish that Renita could have been here today to join us, because she's fantastic too. But if you're listening or watching this and you want Daniel and Renita to come and to bless your church or your ministry, Daniel, how can we find you? How can people reach out and get in contact with you for you to come and share either in music or in presentation of John or any of the other forms of ministry that you have?
They can find us through the website of the Francis Asbury Society that we're connected with, and that's francisasburysociety.com. Or they could reach me through my email address, which is koehnsing@yahoo.com. KOEHNSING@yahoo.com.
We can try and link to that in show notes and put some other things up there. So, all right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Appreciate it.